Thomas Mitchell had served the crown for 15 years, but nothing could have prepared him for what he witnessed that cold December morning. As a senior palace guard, he thought he had seen everything: state secrets whispered in shadowy corridors, diplomatic tensions that never made the headlines, and the weight of duty that pressed down on every royal shoulder. But standing outside the king's private study at 3:47 a.m., listening to a conversation that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy, Thomas realized he was about to become keeper of a secret that could change the course of history. The king's voice, usually so composed and measured, cracked with emotion as he spoke words that would haunt Thomas for the rest of his life. "I cannot choose between my crown and my conscience. God help me, I cannot choose." What Thomas heard next would force him into an impossible position, torn between his oath of loyalty to the crown and his duty to protect the very institution he had sworn to serve. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep, and some choices too terrible to make alone. This is the story of 7 days that tested the limits of loyalty, duty, and the price of truth in the corridors of power. Thomas Mitchell adjusted his earpiece and checked his watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The night shift at Buckingham Palace was usually quiet, filled with routine patrols and the soft footsteps of staff preparing for the next day's events. But tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that seemed to seep through the ancient walls and settle in his chest. He had been walking his regular route through the East Wing when he noticed the light still burning in His Majesty's private study. King Charles rarely worked past midnight, and it was now approaching 4 in the morning. Thomas knew the king's habits well after years of service, and this deviation from routine immediately caught his attention. As he moved closer to the study, he could hear voices through the heavy oak door. The king was not alone. Thomas recognized the second voice as belonging to Sir Geoffrey Pemberton, the private secretary to the king and one of the most powerful men in the royal household. But there was something urgent in their conversation, something that made Thomas pause despite his training to maintain discretion. The palace had been buzzing with unusual activity for the past week. Thomas had noticed more private meetings, hushed conversations that stopped when he entered a room, and an increase in secure communications. The staff seemed on edge, though none would admit it openly. Even Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had worked at the palace for 30 years, had seemed unusually tight-lipped about the king's schedule. Thomas positioned himself at his post near the study door, a position that allowed him to monitor the corridor while remaining unobtrusive. Palace guards were trained to be invisible, to see and hear everything while appearing to notice nothing. But tonight, that training would be put to the ultimate test. Through the heavy door, he could hear the king's voice, strained and weary. "The documents arrived this morning. I've read them 3 times, Geoffrey, and each time I come to the same impossible conclusion." Sir Geoffrey's response was measured, careful. "Your Majesty, we must consider all options. The implications of either choice will reverberate for generations." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. In his 15 years of service, he had overheard countless conversations about state matters, but something about this exchange felt different. There was a gravity to their words that suggested far more than routine royal business, the king continued, his voice growing more agitated. "How does one choose between preserving the monarchy and protecting innocent lives? How do I weigh the stability of the nation against my own moral obligations?" Thomas's training told him to move away, to continue his patrol and forget what he was hearing, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown, but he was beginning to understand that the crown itself might be in danger from within. Sir Geoffrey spoke again, his tone diplomatic but firm. "The intelligence reports are clear, sir. The information contained in those documents, if released, would not only damage the monarchy, but could potentially destabilize our relationships with several Commonwealth nations. The economic implications alone could be catastrophic." "And if I suppress them?" the king asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I bury the truth to protect the institution? Then history may judge us harshly, but at least there will be a future to judge," Sir Geoffrey replied. Thomas felt his mouth go dry. Whatever documents they were discussing, whatever truth was at stake, it was clear that the king was facing a choice that would define his reign. The weight of that realization settled on Thomas like a physical burden. The conversation continued for another hour, with Sir Geoffrey outlining various scenarios and their potential consequences. Thomas learned that a historical investigation into the royal family's activities during World War II had uncovered evidence that, while not implicating the current monarchy directly, would raise serious questions about decisions made by previous generations. The documents, according to what Thomas could piece together, contained evidence of collaboration with certain parties during the war that had been deliberately hidden from public knowledge. The information had come to light through recently declassified intelligence files, and now sat on the king's desk like a ticking bomb. "The Prime Minister is aware?" the king asked. "She has been briefed on the general nature of the situation," Sir Geoffrey confirmed. "She has made it clear that the government will support whatever decision Your Majesty makes, but she has also stressed the potential political ramifications." Thomas understood now why the palace had felt different all week. This was not just about historical embarrassment or political inconvenience. This was about the very legitimacy of the monarchy in the modern era. If the documents were released, they would provide ammunition for Republican movements not just in Britain, but across the Commonwealth. But if they were suppressed, and the truth eventually came out anyway, the damage could be even worse. The king was caught between transparency and survival, between his role as a constitutional monarch and his personal moral code. As dawn began to break over London, the conversation in the study finally wound down. Sir Geoffrey left through a private exit, but the king remained in his study. Thomas could see the silhouette through the gap under the door, a solitary figure hunched over his desk, carrying the weight of an impossible decision. Thomas completed his shift and returned to his small flat near the palace, but sleep eluded him. He found himself staring at the ceiling, replaying every word he had heard. He thought about his oath of service, about the years of training that had taught him to be loyal, discreet, and above all, silent. But he also thought about his father, who had fought in World War II and had always spoken about the importance of truth and accountability. What would his father think about suppressing historical evidence, no matter how damaging it might be? The next morning, Thomas returned to his duties with a new burden. He found himself watching the king more carefully, noting the strain in his face, the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. During the morning briefing with the security team, he learned that the king's schedule had been cleared for the next 3 days, officially for private reflection and consultation. Thomas knew better. The king was using that time to make the most difficult decision of his reign, possibly of his life. And Thomas, bound by duty and loyalty, was the only person outside the inner circle who knew the full extent of what was at stake. That evening, as Thomas walked his patrol route, he noticed increased security around certain areas of the palace. Additional guards had been posted near the royal archives, and access to the king's private study had been further restricted. It was clear that whatever decision was coming, preparations were being made for its implementation. Thomas found himself at a crossroads of his own. He had always believed in the monarchy, in its role as a stabilizing force in British society. But he also believed in truth and transparency, values that seemed to be in direct conflict with his loyalty to the crown. As he stood once again outside the king's study, this time in the early hours of his second night shift since overhearing the conversation, Thomas realized that his own choice was becoming increasingly clear. He could remain silent, honoring his oath and protecting the institution he had served faithfully for 15 years, or he could find a way to ensure that the truth, whatever its consequences, would eventually come to light. The king's light was on again, and Thomas could hear the soft scratch of pen on paper. His Majesty was writing, perhaps drafting the statement that would accompany whichever decision he ultimately made. Thomas wondered if the king knew that his words were being witnessed, that his struggle was not as private as he believed. In the silence of the palace corridors, with only the distant sound of London traffic and the king's pen scratching against paper, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He would not betray his oath directly, but he would find a way to ensure that whatever happened in the coming days, there would be a record, a witness to the truth that future generations could rely on. The game of loyalty, duty, and conscience had begun, and Thomas Mitchell, a simple palace guard, had just become an unwitting player in a drama that would define the future of the British monarchy. The third day brought unexpected visitors to the palace. Thomas watched from his post as a series of black cars arrived through the private entrance, their passengers escorted directly to the king's quarters without the usual ceremonial protocols. He recognized the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chief Justice among the arrivals. along with several individuals he did not immediately identify, but whose bearings suggested they were people of considerable importance. Throughout his years of service, Thomas had developed an ability to read the subtle signs that indicated the gravity of palace business. Today, those signs were impossible to miss. The usual staff chatter was replaced by whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached. Senior courtiers moved through the corridors with purposeful urgency, their faces grave and focused. Mrs. Henderson, who had always greeted Thomas with a warm smile, barely acknowledged him as she hurried past carrying a sealed envelope marked with the royal seal. The normal rhythm of palace life had been completely disrupted, replaced by an atmosphere of barely contained crisis. During his afternoon break, Thomas overheard a conversation between two junior secretaries in the staff dining room. They were discussing the unusual number of secure phone calls that had been placed to Commonwealth capitals over the past 24 hours. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and several African nations had all received direct communications from the palace, though the content of these calls remained classified. Thomas realized that whatever decision the king was contemplating had international implications that extended far beyond Britain's borders. The Commonwealth realms, where the king served as head of state, would be directly affected by any revelation that damaged the monarchy's reputation. The timing was particularly sensitive, as several of these nations were already experiencing Republican movements that questioned the relevance of the British monarchy in the 21st century. That evening, Thomas was assigned to additional duties that brought him closer to the king's private quarters. As he conducted his security sweep, he could hear multiple voices from within the study. The meeting had been ongoing for hours, and the tension was palpable even through the heavy doors. Sir Geoffrey emerged briefly to speak with one of the secretaries, and Thomas caught a glimpse of his face. The usually composed private secretary looked haggard, his complexion pale and drawn. Whatever discussions were taking place behind those doors were taking their toll on everyone involved. "The legal implications are staggering," Thomas heard Sir Geoffrey say in a low voice to his assistant. "Either path leads to consequences that could reshape our constitutional framework." Thomas began to piece together more of the puzzle. The documents in question were not just historically embarrassing. They apparently contained information that could have legal ramifications in the present day. Perhaps there were international treaties or agreements that had been made under false pretenses, or commitments that had never been fulfilled. The involvement of the Lord Chief Justice suggested that criminal or civil liability might be at stake. Later that night, Thomas noticed light coming from the palace archives, located in the building's lower levels. This was unusual, as the archives were typically accessed only during normal business hours and required special authorization. His curiosity led him to investigate, though he maintained the pretense of conducting a routine security check. Through a partially open door, he saw several historians and archivists working frantically through boxes of documents. They were wearing white gloves and handling materials with extreme care, photographing certain pages and making detailed notes. The intensity of their work suggested they were racing against time, perhaps trying to verify information or locate additional evidence related to the documents that had triggered this crisis. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the chief royal archivist, was supervising the work. Thomas had always respected her dedication to historical accuracy, and he noticed that she appeared deeply troubled by whatever they had discovered. At one point, she held up a particular document to the light, examining what appeared to be a signature or seal, before shaking her head and placing it carefully in a separate pile. The next morning brought another development that caught Thomas's attention. A senior member of the cabinet arrived for an unscheduled meeting with the king. The foreign secretary's presence suggested that international diplomatic concerns were now taking precedence over domestic considerations. Thomas positioned himself where he could observe the comings and goings from the king's study. The meeting lasted for 3 hours, and when the foreign secretary emerged, he immediately placed several urgent phone calls from a secure room within the palace. Thomas could not overhear the conversations, but the official's animated gestures and frequent pacing suggested that international pressure was being brought to bear on the situation. That afternoon, Thomas noticed preparations being made for what appeared to be a significant announcement. Technical staff arrived to set up recording equipment in the throne room, while communications specialists tested secure video links to various Commonwealth capitals. The palace's media relations team was conspicuously absent from these preparations, suggesting that whatever announcement was planned would be handled through official government channels rather than the usual royal communications apparatus. During his evening patrol, Thomas encountered the king himself in one of the palace's private corridors. His Majesty was walking alone, something that rarely happened given the usual security protocols. Thomas immediately stood to attention, but the king paused and spoke to him directly. "Thomas, isn't it?" The king said, his voice weary but kind. "You've been with us for quite some time." 15 years, Your Majesty," Thomas replied, maintaining his professional composure despite the unexpected personal attention. The king studied him for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. "Tell me, Thomas, what do you believe is the most important duty of those who serve the crown?" The question caught Thomas off guard. It seemed both casual and loaded with significance. "To protect and serve the monarchy, sir, and through it, the nation." "And if those two duties were to come into conflict?" the king asked. "If serving the monarchy required actions that might not serve the nation's best interests?" Thomas felt the weight of the question, understanding that this was not merely theoretical. "I would hope, Your Majesty, that such a conflict would never arise. But if it did, I believe the greater good must always take precedence." The king nodded slowly, a sad smile crossing his face. "The greater good. Yes, that is indeed the question, isn't it? Thank you, Thomas. Your honesty is refreshing." As the king continued down the corridor, Thomas realized that he had just been given a glimpse into the monarch's internal struggle. The question was not just about political expedience or institutional survival. It was about defining what the monarchy should represent in the modern world. The following day brought news that several Commonwealth prime ministers would be arriving for emergency consultations. The meetings were being described as routine discussions about upcoming constitutional changes. But Thomas knew better. The timing and urgency of these visits could only be connected to the crisis unfolding behind closed doors. Thomas found himself thinking about his conversation with the king. The monarch's words suggested that he was leaning toward transparency, toward choosing what he believed was right rather than what was politically safe. But Thomas also understood the enormous pressure that must be weighing on such a decision. That evening, as Thomas walked past the king's study, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The king was on the phone with someone, and his words carried a finality that suggested a decision had been reached. "I cannot live with the weight of this secret," the king was saying. "If the monarchy cannot survive the truth about its past, then perhaps it does not deserve to survive at all." There was a long pause, during which Thomas could hear muffled protests from the other end of the line. Then the king continued, his voice stronger and more resolute. "The announcement will be made tomorrow evening. I want the full contents of the documents released simultaneously to all major news organizations, along with my statement accepting responsibility for the failures of previous generations and outlining the steps we will take to ensure such lapses never occur again." Thomas felt a mixture of admiration and fear. The king had chosen truth over safety, transparency over survival. But Thomas also knew that this decision would unleash forces that could not be controlled or predicted. The monarchy would face its greatest challenge in modern times, and the outcome was far from certain. As he completed his rounds that night, Thomas reflected on the events he had witnessed. He had entered this crisis as a simple palace guard, loyal to his duties and confident in his role. But over the past few days, he had been forced to confront questions about the nature of loyalty, the price of truth, and the responsibilities that came with knowledge. Tomorrow would bring the announcement that would change everything. The king had made his choice, but Thomas realized that he too would soon face a decision about how to use the knowledge he had gained. The game was far from over, and Thomas Mitchell was about to discover just how deep the consequences of royal decisions could reach. The morning of the announcement brought chaos to the palace that Thomas had never witnessed in his 15 years of service. By dawn, news vans had begun gathering outside the gates, though the media had no official confirmation of what was to come. Somehow, word had leaked that a significant royal announcement was planned, and the speculation was reaching fever pitch. Thomas watched from his post as emergency meetings convened in rapid succession. The Prime Minister arrived through the private entrance, her face grim and her entourage larger than usual. She was followed shortly by the leader of the opposition, an unprecedented breach of normal protocol that suggested the government was seeking cross-party consensus for whatever was about to unfold. Inside the palace, staff members moved with barely controlled panic. Thomas overheard fragments of urgent conversations as people hurried past. Constitutional crisis, emergency session of Parliament, and most ominously, transition protocols. The latter phrase made Thomas's stomach drop. He had been trained on transition protocols during his initial security briefing years ago, but they were procedures meant to be implemented only in the event of abdication or death. Sir Geoffrey appeared to have aged years in the space of days. Thomas watched him coordinate a series of phone calls to Commonwealth capitals, each conversation growing more heated than the last. Through an open door, Thomas could hear the private secretary speaking to what sounded like the Governor-General of Australia. "I understand your position," Sir Geoffrey was saying, his voice strained, "but His Majesty's decision is final. Yes, I am aware of the potential ramifications for the constitutional monarchy in Australia. We are prepared to discuss alternative arrangements if necessary." The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. The king's decision to reveal the truth was not just about historical transparency. It might actually result in the dissolution of the monarchy in some Commonwealth nations. Countries that had maintained the British monarch as their head of state might use this crisis as an opportunity to finally become republics. Thomas found himself stationed near the throne room as technical preparations continued for the evening broadcast. The atmosphere was surreal. Technicians worked methodically to set up cameras and lighting, while just meters away, some of the most powerful people in the British establishment debated the future of the monarchy itself. Dr. Thornfield emerged from the archives carrying a leather-bound folder that seemed to weigh more than its physical mass suggested. Thomas recognized this as likely containing the original documents that had started this entire crisis. The historian's face was pale, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying explosives. "Is everything in order?" Sir Geoffrey asked her as she approached the throne room. "As much as it can be," Dr. Thornfield replied. "The documentation is complete, the provenance is unquestionable, and the legal analysis has been verified by 3 independent sources. There will be no room for denial or obfuscation." Thomas understood that whatever was about to be revealed had been meticulously researched and verified. This was not a case of ambiguous evidence or questionable sources. The truth, whatever it was unassailable. Throughout the afternoon, Thomas observed a stream of visitors arriving at the palace. Religious leaders, including not just the Archbishop of Canterbury but representatives from various faiths, suggested that the moral dimensions of the revelation were significant. Constitutional scholars and legal experts came and went, their faces grave as they entered and even graver when they left. The most surprising visitor was Lord Hamilton, a man Thomas recognized as one of the monarchy's most vocal critics in the House of Lords. His presence suggested that the palace was attempting to build consensus even among its traditional opponents, perhaps hoping to minimize the political damage from the revelation. As evening approached, Thomas was assigned to additional security duties that brought him into closer contact with the final preparations. He positioned himself where he could observe the king in the hours before the broadcast, and what he saw troubled him deeply. His Majesty appeared to have found a strange peace in his decision. The anguish and uncertainty of the previous days had been replaced by a calm resolve that seemed almost otherworldly. Thomas had seen this transformation before, in soldiers he had served with who had made peace with dangerous missions. It was the look of someone who had accepted the consequences of their choices, regardless of personal cost. The king's equerry approached Thomas with specific instructions. "His Majesty has requested that you be present in the antechamber during the broadcast," the man said. "He has specifically asked for guards who have demonstrated discretion and loyalty over many years of service." Thomas felt a chill. The king's request suggested that he was aware, or at least suspected, that Thomas had overheard the conversations of recent days. Perhaps the monarch wanted witnesses to his final act of transparency, people who could attest to the integrity of his decision-making process. As the broadcast time approached, Thomas took his position in the antechamber adjacent to the throne room. From there he could see the king preparing for what might be the most important speech of his reign. His Majesty was dressed in a simple dark suit rather than ceremonial robes, a choice that seemed to emphasize the gravity and humility of the moment. The king reviewed his notes one final time, then set them aside. Thomas realized that the monarch intended to speak largely from memory, making the address more personal and immediate. This was not going to be a formal statement read from a teleprompter. It was going to be a direct appeal from one human being to millions of others. At exactly 8 o'clock, the red light on the cameras came on, and King Charles began to speak. His voice was clear and steady, but Thomas could detect the underlying emotion that threatened to break through his composure. "My fellow citizens of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms," the king began, "I come before you tonight to address a matter of grave importance to our shared history and our collective future." Thomas watched as the king outlined the discovery of documents in recently declassified archives, documents that revealed decisions made by the royal family during World War II that had been hidden from public knowledge for 8 decades. The details were devastating. Evidence of communications with Nazi sympathizers, knowledge of Holocaust activities that was not acted upon, and financial arrangements that had benefited the royal family at the expense of victims of persecution. The documents showed that while the royal family had publicly supported the war effort, private correspondence revealed a more complex and troubling reality. There had been attempts to negotiate separate peace agreements, communications with individuals later convicted of war crimes, and a consistent pattern of prioritizing royal financial interests over humanitarian concerns. "I cannot undo the choices made by my predecessors," the king continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "But I can ensure that the truth is no longer hidden, and that we face our history with the honesty and accountability that our citizens deserve." Thomas felt the weight of history in that room. He was witnessing a moment that would be studied and debated for generations, a decision that prioritized moral clarity over political survival. The king was essentially offering up the monarchy on the altar of truth, accepting that the institution might not survive the revelation. The broadcast continued for 25 minutes, during which the king outlined not just the historical revelations, but also a comprehensive plan for reparations, historical research, and constitutional reform. He announced the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the opening of all royal archives to independent researchers, and his personal commitment to working with Commonwealth nations to address the legacy of these revelations. Perhaps most significantly, the king announced that he would support any Commonwealth nation that chose to become a republic in response to these revelations, and that he would not stand in the way of constitutional changes in the United Kingdom itself if the people demanded them. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, the throne room fell into a profound silence. The king sat alone on the throne, no longer surrounded by the advisors and courtiers who had tried to dissuade him from this course of action. Thomas could see the exhaustion in his posture, but also something that might have been relief. Sir Geoffrey entered the room and approached the throne. "It's done, Your Majesty," he said simply. "Yes," the king replied, "it's done." The immediate aftermath was swift and dramatic. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, Thomas could hear the roar of crowds gathering outside the palace gates. News organizations around the world began breaking into regular programming to report on the unprecedented royal admission. The phones in the palace began ringing constantly as world leaders, Commonwealth governors general, and media organizations sought clarification and comment. Thomas watched as the king's private secretary began implementing what appeared to be predetermined crisis protocols. Staff members moved through the palace with folders and sealed envelopes, apparently delivering prepared statements to various government departments and diplomatic missions. The king himself retired to his private quarters, but Thomas could see that the lights remained on throughout the night. His Majesty was undoubtedly monitoring the global reaction to his decision, watching as the consequences of his choice played out across continents and time zones. As Thomas completed his shift in the early hours of the morning, he reflected on what he had witnessed. The king had indeed chosen conscience over crown, truth over survival. But the real test would come in the days and weeks that followed, as the British people and the Commonwealth nations digested the full implications of the revelations and decided whether the monarchy could survive such unprecedented honesty. Thomas realized that his own role in these events was far from over. As one of the few people who had witnessed the king's decision-making process firsthand, he might soon be called upon to provide testimony or evidence about the integrity of the revelation. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders as he left the palace, knowing that when he returned for his next shift, he would be guarding an institution that might be fundamentally different from the one he had served for 15 years. The morning after the king's broadcast brought a transformed London to Thomas's eyes. As he approached the palace for his shift, he could see that the crowds outside the gates had not dispersed overnight. Instead, they had grown larger and more organized. Some held signs supporting the king's courage in revealing the truth, while others demanded his immediate abdication. The divide was stark and emotional, with police barriers the only thing preventing confrontations between opposing groups. Thomas passed through the staff entrance, noting the increased security measures that had been implemented overnight. Additional guards had been called in from other royal residences, and every person entering the palace was subjected to enhanced screening procedures. The atmosphere inside was tense but purposeful, as if everyone understood that they were now living through a historic crisis that would define the monarchy's future. The first person Thomas encountered was Mrs. Bilcook Henderson, who looked as though she had not slept. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of the strain everyone was feeling, but her voice remained steady as she briefed the security staff on new protocols. International media are requesting access to areas of the palace that have never been open to outsiders, she explained. Historical researchers from universities around the world are demanding to examine the archives, and we have received formal communications from 6 Commonwealth governments requesting clarification on the constitutional implications of His Majesty's announcement. Thomas learned that the immediate global reaction had been even more dramatic than anyone had anticipated. Within hours of the broadcast, the Australian Parliament had called an emergency session to debate the future of the monarchy. The Canadian Prime Minister had issued a statement supporting the King's courage, while noting that discussions about constitutional change were now inevitable. Several Caribbean nations had announced their intention to pursue republican status, using the crisis as the catalyst they had long sought. Perhaps most significantly, opinion polls conducted overnight in the United Kingdom showed the population almost evenly split on whether the king should abdicate. The revelation had not just damaged the monarchy, it had divided the entire nation in ways that would take years to heal. Sir Geoffrey appeared more composed than he had in recent days, though Thomas could see the toll the crisis was taking on him. The private secretary was coordinating responses to hundreds of inquiries from governments, media organizations, and constitutional scholars. Every statement had to be carefully crafted to avoid further inflaming an already volatile situation. His Majesty will address Parliament this afternoon, Sir Geoffrey announced to the senior staff. This is unprecedented in modern constitutional history, but these are unprecedented circumstances. The king wishes to answer questions directly from elected representatives, rather than filtering his responses through intermediaries. Thomas realized that the king was continuing to choose transparency over protection, even as the political and constitutional risks multiplied. Speaking directly to Parliament would expose him to hostile questioning from Republican members, while potentially creating new constitutional precedents that could further weaken the monarchy's position. Throughout the morning, Thomas observed a steady stream of visitors arriving at the palace. Constitutional scholars, historians, and legal experts came to examine the documents that had triggered the crisis. Dr. Thornfield led tours through the archives, allowing independent verification of the evidence that supported the king's revelations. Thomas noticed that these experts emerged from their examinations looking grave but impressed by the thoroughness of the documentation. Whatever criticism might be leveled at the monarchy's historical actions, no one could question the integrity of the research that had uncovered them, or the completeness of the current disclosure. The king's speech to Parliament was broadcast live, and Thomas watched from the palace as his monarch faced the most hostile audience of his reign. Republican members demanded his immediate abdication, while some conservative members questioned his judgment in revealing information that damaged British interests. The king answered every question directly, refusing to hide behind diplomatic language or constitutional immunity. "I did not reveal this information to damage the monarchy," the king stated in response to one particularly aggressive questioner. "I revealed it because the monarchy can only survive in the modern world if it is founded on truth rather than convenient fiction. If we cannot survive honesty about our past, then we do not deserve to survive at all." The session lasted for 3 hours, during which the king faced questions about everything from the specific historical revelations to the constitutional implications of his decision. Thomas was struck by his monarch's composure and clarity, even when faced with demands for his abdication or calls for the complete abolition of the monarchy. That evening brought news that would change everything once again. Thomas was present when Sir Geoffrey received a phone call that made him pale visibly. After hanging up, the private secretary immediately requested an emergency meeting with the king. Thomas positioned himself where he could observe the meeting, though he could not hear the specific details of their conversation. Whatever news Sir Geoffrey had received clearly represented a new development in the crisis. The two men spoke for nearly an hour, with the king's expressions ranging from surprise to concern to what appeared to be resignation. Later that night, Thomas learned what had prompted the emergency meeting. A group of historians working independently of the Royal Archives had discovered additional documents in foreign archives that corroborated and extended the revelations made by the king. But these new documents also contained evidence that some members of the current royal family had been aware of the historical cover-up and had chosen to maintain it. The discovery meant that the king's decision to reveal the truth was not just about historical honesty. It was potentially about protecting himself and his immediate family from future accusations of participating in a cover-up. Critics would now claim that the revelation had been motivated by self-preservation rather than moral courage. Thomas watched as the king grappled with this new reality. The monarch had made his decision based on principle, but the discovery of additional evidence suggested that his hand might have been forced anyway. The integrity of his choice was now being questioned, even as the consequences continued to unfold around him. The following days brought a cascade of developments that tested everyone's ability to process the rapidly changing situation. 3 Commonwealth nations formally announced their intention to become republics, while 2 others called for constitutional conventions to discuss the future of the monarchy. In the United Kingdom, polls showed growing support for a referendum on the monarchy's future. Thomas found himself assigned to increasingly sensitive duties as the palace adapted to its new reality. He was present during meetings with constitutional lawyers who were exploring the legal mechanisms for potential abdication, succession, or even the peaceful transition to a republican form of government. The king, meanwhile, seemed to have found peace with his decision despite its consequences. Thomas observed him during his daily routines, noting that His Majesty appeared more relaxed than he had been during the agonizing days before the revelation. Whatever the outcome, he had chosen to act according to his conscience, and that choice seemed to have lifted a burden he had been carrying. One evening, as Thomas conducted his patrol past the king's study, he was surprised to be called into a private audience. The king was alone, reading what appeared to be correspondence from citizens around the world. "Thomas," the king said, gesturing to a chair, "please sit down." Thomas remained standing, unsure of the protocol for such an informal interaction. "I want to thank you," the king continued, "for your discretion and loyalty during these difficult weeks. I am aware that you overheard conversations that were meant to be private, and I appreciate that you maintained your professional standards despite the extraordinary circumstances." Thomas felt his face flush. "Your Majesty, I would never." "Of course you wouldn't," the king interrupted gently. "But I also want you to know that your presence during those conversations was, in some ways, helpful to me. Knowing that ordinary people like yourself might be witnesses to these decisions reminded me that I serve not just the institution of monarchy, but the people who trust that institution to act with integrity." The king paused, studying Thomas's face. "What do you think of what I've done?" The question was so direct, so personal, that Thomas struggled to find an appropriate response. Finally, he decided on honesty. "I think, Your Majesty, that you chose to do what you believed was right, regardless of the personal cost. That strikes me as the kind of leadership the country needs." The king nodded slowly. "History will judge whether that assessment is correct. But I can live with history's judgment in a way that I could not live with maintaining a lie." 2 weeks later, Thomas received news that would change his own life as dramatically as the king's decision had changed the monarchy. He was informed that he had been selected to testify before a parliamentary committee investigating the historical revelations and the decision-making process that led to their disclosure. The committee wanted to understand not just what had been revealed, but how the decision to reveal it had been made. Thomas's position as an inadvertent witness to the king's deliberations made his testimony crucial to establishing the integrity and authenticity of the entire process. As Thomas prepared for his testimony, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had begun as a simple palace guard, committed to protecting the monarchy and maintaining its secrets, but circumstances had forced him to become something more. A witness to history, a keeper of truth, and ultimately a participant in the transformation of one of the world's oldest institutions. The monarchy would survive the crisis, though in a greatly changed form. Public support, initially divided, gradually shifted toward admiration for the king's courage in choosing truth over convenience. The constitutional reforms that followed created a more transparent, accountable form of constitutional monarchy that served as a model for other nations. Thomas continued to serve as a palace guard, but his role had evolved beyond mere security. He became part of a new transparency initiative, helping to ensure that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. The palace he protected was no longer a repository of secrets, but a symbol of the possibility that even ancient institutions could choose honesty over self-preservation. Years later, when historians studied the crisis that transformed the British monarchy, they would focus on the king's courage in revealing uncomfortable truths. But Thomas knew that the real story was more complex. It was about the weight of conscience, the price of truth, and the discovery that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is the willingness to risk everything for what is right. The choice between crown and conscience had been made, and in the end, both had survived, though forever changed by the experience.